compliment the University of Pavia for engaging in this doc course addressing the needs of humanitarian workers. International cooperation definitely needs people who are not only strongly motivated and dedicated, but who also can deal with professional challenges that are getting more and more demanding given the ongoing crisis of our world. I rejoice in particular at the work of NOHA and at the University of Pavia rejoining it. Pavia will certainly bring its invaluable experience and extensive international network to the work of NOHA. Today, more than ever, humanitarian action requires highly skilled professional expertise, since it targets scenarios that are increasingly complex, dangerous, and unpredictable. In an area of instability that ranges from Western Africa to Afghanistan, as shown in the map made by ECHO on states' vulnerability. Okay, here we are. So you have countries in red, which show situation, crisis of high vulnerability, and the stars indicate, according to this classification of ECHO, the so-called forgotten crisis. We are currently going through an extremely challenging phase for international humanitarian aid, with 4 crises rated at their maximum level, level 3, according to the United Nations system. So these 4 crises are namely Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. Plus, we have the Ebola crisis, the Ebola epidemic classified at the maximum level by a number of UN agencies. It is the first time in history, actually, that we have been facing so many crises of this magnitude. It is worth noting that in most cases, with the sole exception of Ebola, they are tragedies caused by human beings due to internal or religious conflicts. The impact of such crisis on the affected population is extremely serious. The Syrian crisis alone has caused 200,000 deaths in 3 years and forced approximately 4 million people to flee to neighboring countries, while the brutality of ISIS in Iraq and Syria is well documented through the media. As for Ebola, the figures are sadly telling. The number of infected people totaled 13,000, of whom more than 5,000 have died. The forecasts for the coming months are by no means encouraging. Public opinion is probably less familiar with what is currently happening in the Central African Republic, where children are still being forced to become soldiers. Those children are often victims of brutal violence and mutilation. In South Sudan, thousands of children below the age of 5 still risk dying from malnutrition, whereas the situation in Somalia remains deeply volatile, and 90,000 Sahrawi refugees have been waiting for 40 years in Algerian camps to go back to a decent life. There are just a few of the forgotten crises, but we could provide countless examples of populations that are living in extremely difficult conditions, with none of the attention that they should be given by the media and the international community. For instance, the Rohingya in Myanmar, a Muslim minority subjected to violence and discrimination. Nowadays, addressing humanitarian crisis has become more and more complicated because such crises themselves have become more complex and delicate given the role played by non-state actors such as ISIS that do not recognize the principles of international humanitarian law and brutally act even against civilians and humanitarian workers. For instance, they attack humanitarian convoys, besiege civilian communities, and use schools and hospitals for their military operations. Humanitarian intervention is therefore not just complicated, but also dangerous, as shown by the abduction of 2 young Italian volunteers in Syria, kidnapped in August while they were in the country for a humanitarian mission. There exists a serious problem in terms of humanitarian workers' security, especially when they are not seen as neutral actors, but rather identified with one of the parts in the conflict. Data for 2013, recently issued by the United Nations, shows that the number of attacks against humanitarian workers was unprecedented. 155 were killed, 171 seriously injured, and 134 kidnapped. Managing humanitarian aid requires specific skills and a professional approach, as well as the ability to meet the real needs of the beneficiaries in a rapid and effective way. We should stress the importance of not violating the do no harm principle, as it was recalled by Dr. Herman, and abstaining from any form of judgment with respect to the beneficiary populations. Humanitarian assistance must be very carefully designed to avoid any damaging effects, even unintentionally, on the targeted populations. Even though it may sound paradoxical, we all recall initiatives that led to additional problems, such as distortions to local economies, discriminating practices within the beneficiary groups, excessive dependence on aid, mostly due to incomplete knowledge of the specific context or to the lack of synergy, either full or partial, with local and international actors. If professionalism and competence must be fundamental aspects of humanitarian work, they are not enough. The humanitarian worker who operates in emergency context must be, more than ever, motivated by a humanitarian spirit, which is essential to deal with beneficiary communities, feeling their needs, being aware of their cultural and religious practices, and helping them in the most effective way possible, promoting the so-called ownership of the intervention. The encounter with a human being in need must always be at the core of the humanitarian work. Going back to the concept of ownership, we should stress the importance of our public opinion, because our citizens are the real donors. The Italians have proved very generous on several occasions, particularly when they felt sure about the correct use of their donations. This is why it is fundamental to act with the maximum transparency possible, not just disseminating information on the implementation of the interventions and the achievement of their goals, but also on the budget at the Ministry's disposal, in our case. In the case of the Emergency Office at the Directorate General for Development Cooperation, the budget will be 82 million euros in 2014, 56% through the multilateral channel, 40% through bilateral interventions, and 4% for mine clearance. Our interventions mostly target the Mediterranean region and the Middle East. The Syrian crisis, in particular, 45%, Palestine, 9%, the Forgotten crisis, an overall of 18%, and Western Africa, 13%, of which 8% for Ebola. Although it may sound bizarre to plan emergency activities, you will notice that our aid programs are focused on areas of strategic interest to Italy, with the aim of targeting crises that could lead to negative spillover effects in Europe, especially in terms of security and migration. We act in full respect of the principles of humanity, neutrality, independence, and impartiality. which is also essential for guaranteeing our humanitarian workers' security. The challenges that the international community will face in 2015 are numerous and deeply intertwined, ranging from the need to guarantee humanitarian workers' security to a European Union that is able to speak with one voice on humanitarian issues, from the importance of coordination, including the protection of civilian and military operations, to forging public-private partnerships. These are just some of the topics on our agenda that we are negotiating and discussing during the semester of Italian presidency. The first challenge for humanitarian aid is certainly to ensure humanitarian workers can safely access the communities who are victims of a crisis. This is the preliminary condition for an effective response that reaches all the people in need in an impartial, neutral, and independent way. Humanitarian access is therefore a prerequisite for humanitarian action, both in cases of natural disasters, but mainly in conflict zones. I will go back to Syria, where 4.7 million people currently live in areas that are either difficult to reach or under siege, and where it is important but extremely difficult to keep a balance between interventions to help those communities who still live in regions that are under the government's control and the so-called freed areas. In this respect, it is worth mentioning the Resolution 2165 of the UN Security Council that does not bind humanitarian operations in the Syrian territory to the approval of the government in Damascus, but just requires a notification, thus allowing trans-border operations and operations across the conflict lines in the most remote areas of the country. This resolution is the result of a dedicated lobbying promoted by the United Nations and strongly supported by Italy. It is clear that humanitarian aid requires political will in the noblest sense of the word. Political will is needed to progress a humanitarian agenda that promotes the importance of international humanitarian law and its application by governments, opposition forces, and whoever controls de facto a territory. This is what is called humanitarian advocacy, one of the priorities, as I said before, of the Italian presidency's program on humanitarian issues. We are currently working for a EU humanitarian strategy that encourages the adoption of policies that could enhance the response to emergencies and the protection of populations through a series of interventions that could improve humanitarian access. We firmly believe that the EU, the major donor at the international level, is a model of leadership, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of raising awareness on humanitarian issues among non-EU countries and international organizations. Humanitarian aid must stay neutral, independent, and impartial. This does not mean that under very specific circumstances and in full respect for international humanitarian law, it should not resort to some sort of military support, support from military forces. The last experience in this regard was in Iraqi Kurdistan last August, where the Italian cooperation was able to deliver humanitarian aid to communities fleeing ISIS, thanks to the support of the Italian Air Force. So in that case, the Italian force provided the carriers. This case represents an example of the contribution that the military could give to humanitarian action in cases where there is no other possible option, and of course limited, as I said, to this kind of logistical support. A combination of humanitarian aid and military support without hampering the neutral soul of the humanitarian aid is a challenge that we should get ready to confront more and more frequently in order to facilitate humanitarian access where there are actors such as ISIS who do not respect the principles of international humanitarian aid. An effective response to crisis implies using all the tools at the international community's disposal to protect and save human lives. We cannot ignore the fact that, alongside the competences of our humanitarian workers, the civil protection institutions possess specific skills that could strengthen the efficacy and effectiveness of humanitarian action, especially in cases of natural disasters, including prevention activities based on the use of high-tech tools and devices. Moreover, recent EU reforms have created the European Mechanism of Civil Protection, which facilitates the deployment of national civil protection assets as part of the humanitarian response to the international crisis. However, the assessment of such deployments has revealed some weaknesses on the response side, mainly due to a lack of coordination and blurred definitions of roles in the field. The Italian Presidency is therefore promoting a detailed discussion on this topic within the relevant groups of the European Council, that on humanitarian aid, whose acronym is COHAFA, and that on civil protection, the so-called PROCIV, with the aim of drawing some useful conclusions that, on the basis of past experience, could enhance the coordination between the two tools for greater effectiveness. The partnership with the private sector and the use of new technology are themes for the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016, and they are core topics of the international debate. The World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul will be a meeting of major importance, a sort of General Assembly on international humanitarian cooperation that the United Nations are organizing at this time. The next preparatory event is scheduled in Budapest in February 2015. Given our past experience, we have reappraised the collaboration between humanitarian aid and the private sector, going beyond stereotypes and negative judgments that have been keeping these two sectors apart. Just to mention one example, the government of Luxembourg, thanks to a partnership with a national telephone company, is able to install satellite antennas just after a natural disaster, which make possible the reactivation of communication systems, often crucial to save human lives. More recently, the United Kingdom, in collaboration with a private company, has parachuted solar chargers for cell phones into Iraqi Kurdistan. In Jordan, the World Food Programme is currently piloting the use of electronic vouchers for Syrian refugees to replace cash for purchasing staple foods. The Italian cooperation as well funds a program whereby the welfare program makes use of satellite technologies to ensure the most effective distribution of aid throughout Palestine. The World Humanitarian Summit will thus be the perfect occasion to discuss how we can strengthen our monitoring of potential crises and target the sources of instability in order to intervene before it is too late. We cannot tolerate any longer cases such as the Central African Republic, South Sudan, or Mali, crises that broke out, and I quote, unexpectedly, although the signs of instability were already clear. We should strengthen the humanitarian component of development cooperation. Nowadays, it accounts for a negligible share, approximately 1% of the European Commission's budget. And I would say that an overall 1% of the global official development assistance goes to humanitarian aid. Recently, a senior official of UN OHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Aid of the United Nations, asked me rhetorically what the difference might make an extra 1% dedicated to humanitarian aid compared with the marginal efficiency of the same amount going to long-term development. And this is an interesting and fundamental question. We should also ensure that our assistance targets the most vulnerable groups. It is not sufficient, given the widespread economic crisis and the mounting needs, that Western countries do their part. We need to enlarge the donors group, for example, involving more actively the Gulf cooperation countries and emerging economies such as China, India, Brazil, so that the spirit of solidarity, the spirit of Solferino, as you know from the Battle of Solferino actually was born the International Red Cross, so that the spirit of solidarity goes beyond Europe and a few other countries. To sum up, humanitarian action needs professionalism, commitment, motivation, but also flexibility, involving all the actors and tools that could give added value to humanitarian response for the sake of the beneficiary populations. We operate in a world that has deeply changed in recent years from the point of view of the protagonists and the tools for action. New donors have joined the scene, new actors from the private sector and the non-profit sector. Non-governmental organizations, as you well know, have become more professional and gone international, increasingly working in partnerships with other actors and diversifying their sources of fundraising. Important economic institutions, I'm thinking of the philanthropic foundations, banks, but also banks of cooperative credit or trade chambers, have joined the humanitarian aid scene as collector of funds, but also as actors in charge of the implementation of initiatives of humanitarian aid. We also have at our disposal innovative tools whose existence was unimaginable just a few years ago. New forms of collaboration between public bodies that have been evolving. The tools that we use to finance humanitarian and development projects have also become more sophisticated. The new law on international cooperation, approved by the Italian Parliament last August, tries to address these new aspects and incorporate them in a new framework that is taking shape with the preparation of the implementation decrees. I believe that the new regulatory framework will pave the way for stronger interaction between the non-profit sector and the field of humanitarian assistance. I wish to give you warm encouragement to pursue the career path that you have chosen. Do not allow yourself to be deterred by the difficulties that you will face in the future. The career of the humanitarian worker, the ability to help others, to positively affect the life of the most vulnerable people, will largely reward you for all your sacrifices. Thank you very much.